Enjoy today's story, The Flame That Burned Through Time, Napoleon and Joséphine. Part 1. A Spark in the Shadow of Revolution. Autumn, 1795 draped Paris in a restless haze. The French Revolution had left its scars. Streets still reeked of blood from the terror. Yet the salons of the elite shimmered with candlelight, silk gowns, and the clink of wine glasses. Napoleon Bonaparte, a 26-year-old artillery officer from Corsica, stepped into this world as an outsider. Fresh from his triumph at Toulon, he was a rising star, but to the Parisian aristocracy, he remained a provincial oddity, short, with unkempt hair, and a thick Corsican accent that marked him as more soldier than gentleman. That night, at a dinner hosted by Paul Barras, a shrewd revolutionary leader, fate ignited a fire that would define his life. Across the room stood Marie-Joseph Rose Tacher de la Pagerie, Joséphine, as he would later call her. At 32, she was a widow shaped by the darkest days of the Revolution. Her first husband, Alexandre de Beauharnais, had met the guillotine, leaving her with two children, Eugène and Hortense, and a fragile beauty tempered by resilience. Joséphine wasn't flawless by the era's standards. Her teeth were uneven, her voice raspy from months in damp prison cells, but she exuded an intoxicating charm. Deep brown eyes that held an ocean of mystery, lips curved in a whisper of allure, and a presence that moved through the crowd. Gentle, yet commanding, like a breeze that could unravel the strongest heart. Napoleon, a man of cannon smoke and hoofbeats, felt suddenly small in her gaze. As she approached, her voice rang like a melody. "I hear you've made the Austrians tremble, General. But can a woman make you falter?" It was a playful jab, light yet piercing, and it struck him like an arrow. He laughed, a rare, awkward sound, and replied, "No, madam, but I fear I'd surrender if you were my foe." The room chuckled, but in the glance they shared, a spark flared, tiny, yet potent enough to set an empire ablaze. That night, back in his shabby rented room, Napoleon couldn't sleep. Joséphine haunted him, her sleek black hair pinned elegantly, her silk dress clinging to her lithe frame, her eyes piercing his soul. He sat at his desk, hand trembling, as he took up his pen and wrote his first letter. "You've stolen my sleep, Joséphine. I see you in every light, every shadow. I no longer know who I am, only that I need you, as the wind needs the sky. Let me love you, or I will die." He sent it at dawn, his heart pounding like a boy's first infatuation. But Joséphine, reading it by candlelight, merely smiled faintly, set it aside, and went on with her day. She had loved and lost before. Her heart was a fortress, not easily breached by the passionate words of a young soldier. Part 2. Letters from the Battlefield. Napoleon didn't relent. In the weeks that followed, he sought every chance to see her again, crashing salons, making unannounced visits to her home on Rue Chantereine. He brought small tokens, a handful of wildflowers snatched from a roadside, a book of military tactics he thought might amuse her. But it wasn't the gifts that caught her eye. It was his gaze, fierce, burning, as if she were the final battlefield he longed to conquer. She began to respond, if only with fleeting remarks. "You're a strange one, Monsieur Bonaparte, a man of war, yet so soft before love." By March 1796, after months of tense pursuit, Napoleon persuaded Joséphine to marry him. The ceremony was rushed, held in a drab Paris office. He arrived 2 hours late, sweaty from a meeting with his generals to plan the Italian campaign. Joséphine, in a simple white silk gown, waited with a patient smile. but in the records, she'd slyly shaved years off her age, narrowing the gap with her new husband. As the clerk declared them wed, Napoleon took her hand and whispered, "You are my greatest victory, Joséphine." She smiled, but a flicker of unease stirred within her. She wasn't sure she was ready to belong to anyone so completely. Their wedding night was a curious tale. Stepping into her bedroom, Napoleon was met with a growl and a sharp nip from her little pug, Fortuné. "He doesn't like invaders." Joséphine laughed, scooping the dog into her arms. Napoleon winced, then grinned. "I'll conquer him too, just as I've conquered you." He pulled her close, and in that moment, amid Fortuné's grumbling and their shared laughter, an invisible thread bound them together. But the joy lasted only 2 days. Orders came for Napoleon to march to Italy, leading the French army against the Austrian coalition. Before departing, he held her tightly, murmuring, "Wait for me and write to me. I'll bring the world to lay at your feet." She nodded, but as his figure faded down the dusty road, Joséphine turned back to her life. Lavish parties, chats with friends, days slipping by without him near. From the battlefield, Napoleon wrote ceaselessly. His letters were a torrent of frenzy and yearning. "Joséphine, you are my breath, my light in the darkness of war. A day without word from you is a death by inches. Come to me, I beg, or I'll forsake this world to return to you." He sent them on galloping horses, defying bombs and sleepless nights. But in Paris, Joséphine rarely replied. She let his letters pile up on her desk, glancing at them briefly before folding them away, slipping into her finest gowns, and stepping into the dazzling whirl of candlelit balls. To her, Napoleon was a distant dream, intense but unreal in the world she inhabited. Part 3. The Seeds of Betrayal. The Italian campaign was a string of triumphs for Napoleon. He crushed the Austrians at Arcole, seized Milan, and became a hero in France's eyes. Amid the cheers and gunpowder, his heart stayed fixed on Joséphine. He pictured her waiting in Paris, reading his letters by candlelight, her eyes aglow with pride. Reality painted a starkly different scene. Winter 1796 found Napoleon encamped in a frigid Italian outpost. One evening, as snow dusted the ground, a trusted aide, Junot, a loyal man with a heavy heart, entered his tent. "Sir," Junot began, voice trembling, "I hate to trouble you, but there are rumors from Paris. They say Madame Bonaparte is seen with another man, a young lieutenant, Hippolyte Charles." The name hit Napoleon like a thunderclap. He shot to his feet, eyes blazing, his fist slamming the wooden table, splintering it and spilling red wine like blood. "She dares!" he roared, his voice cutting through the night. "I fight for her, bleed for her, and she dares make a fool of me?" Junot bowed his head, silent. Napoleon stormed out, pacing beneath a star-strewn sky, rage boiling in his chest. He'd heard murmurs before, that Joséphine was unfaithful, that she squandered the money he sent, but he'd refused to believe them. Now, Hippolyte Charles' name was a dagger in his heart. He returned to his tent, sat in the dim glow of an oil lamp, and scrawled a letter. "Joséphine, who do you take me for? A fool to toy with. If you love another, say it. Don't kill me with your silence and lies." But as dawn broke, he tore it to shreds, the scraps fluttering to the floor. He couldn't send it, not from fear, but because deep within, he couldn't fathom a life without her. From then on, each victory took on a new hue, not just for France's glory, but to prove to Joséphine he was worthy of her. He sent back spoils of war, gold, rare paintings, prized stallions, with notes. All this is for you, Joséphine. Love me as I love you. But the treasures only drew a faint smile from her. She tucked them into a corner and carried on, entwined with Hippolyte Charles, a young, handsome man, with a charming smile and sweet words Napoleon could never rival. Part 4. A Flame, Tested by Distance. As 1797 dawned, Napoleon's conquests grew, but so did the distance between him and Joséphine. He begged her to join him in Italy, imagining her by his side, her elegance softening the harshness of camp life, her voice a balm after battle. "Bring the children if you must," he wrote, "but come. I cannot live half a man without you." Her replies, when they came, were maddeningly brief. "The roads are too rough, my love. Perhaps later." Later never came. In Paris, Joséphine thrived. She'd transformed her home into a haven of luxury, hosting gatherings where poets recited verses, musicians played, and suitors vied for her attention. Hippolyte Charles, with his easy charm and dashing uniform, became a fixture at her side. Whispers spread. Servants saw them laughing late into the night, their hands brushing in fleeting, forbidden touches. She wore the jewels Napoleon sent, but they adorned her for another man's gaze. Napoleon heard the tales through letters from friends, each word a fresh wound. One night, after routing the enemy at Rivoli, he sat alone, staring at a miniature portrait of Joséphine he carried in his coat. "Why?" he muttered, tracing her painted smile. "I give you everything, yet you give me nothing." He resolved to summon her, to force her to see the man she'd married. Not just a soldier, but a soul tethered to hers. He sent a carriage with an escort, a command disguised as a plea. "Come to me, Joséphine. I will not ask again." She didn't come. Instead, she wrote back, "My health is frail, my dear. Paris needs me too." The lie stung worse than any betrayal. Napoleon threw the letter into the fire, watching it curl and blacken, his hands clenched until his knuckles whitened. "She mocks me," he hissed to Juno, who stood silently by. "But I'll not let her go. Not yet." Part 5. The Desert's Fury. By the summer of 1798, Napoleon's ambitions had carried him far from the muddy fields of Italy to the sun-scorched sands of Egypt. The campaign was a bold gambit to disrupt British trade routes and carve a French foothold in the East. But beneath the grand strategy simmered a personal fire. Joséphine remained a phantom in his mind, her absence a wound that festered with every passing day. He named a ship after her, La Joséphine, its white sails cutting through the Mediterranean like a tribute to the woman he couldn't forget. As he stood on the deck, the sea breeze tugging at his coat, he murmured to the horizon, "She'll see my glory and come running back." Egypt was a land of extremes, blazing days and frigid nights, pyramids looming like silent judges over his army. Napoleon threw himself into the conquest with a ferocity that stunned his men. He routed the Mamluks at the Battle of the Pyramids, his voice ringing out over the chaos. "Soldiers, 40 centuries looked down upon you." Yet as the dust settled and the cheers faded, he retreated to his tent, pulling out her letters, those few, terse notes she deigned to send. "Be safe, my love." One read, scribbled in haste, "Paris is dull without your victories." He clutched it to his chest, imagining her penning it by candlelight, her dark hair falling over her shoulders. But the fantasy soured with every whisper that reached him from across the sea. The rumors had followed him like vultures. Aides spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting away when he glared. One evening, as the sun dipped below the dunes A courier arrived with a sealed packet from Paris, not from Joséphine, but from a friend, François Charles. Napoleon tore it open, his hand steady until he read the words. She spends your gold on silks and wine, and Hippolyte Charles struts at her side like a peacock. They say she laughs at your letters, Bonaparte. The paper crumpled in his fist, his breath ragged. Laughs? He growled, pacing the tent. I spill blood for her, and she laughs? He summoned his generals that night, his face a mask of stone. She's made a mockery of me, he declared, voice low and lethal. I'll divorce her. I'll cast her out and find a woman who knows my worth. The men nodded, accustomed to his temper, but none dared speak. Alone later, he sat by a flickering lamp, the desert wind howling outside. He pulled their wedding ring from a chain around his neck, its gold glinting in the dim light. What am I without you? He whispered, tears welling despite his fury. He couldn't do it. Not yet. The ring stayed, a silent tether to the woman who held his soul. Part 6. A dagger in the sand. The Egyptian campaign pressed on, each victory a hollow echo without Joséphine's praise. Napoleon wrote to her still, though his tone shifted, less pleading, more commanding. You will come to me, Joséphine, or I'll drag you here myself. I've built an empire for you. Honor it. She didn't come. Instead, she sent excuses. The heat would kill me, my dear. I cheer your triumphs from afar. Each refusal stoked his rage, but it was a letter from his brother Joseph that broke him. Delivered in September 1798, the message was blunt. She's a fool, Napoleon. Hippolyte Charles lives in your house, wears your gifts, beds your wife. Paris laughs behind your back. Napoleon staggered, clutching the table as the words seared into him. He imagined them. Joséphine in her silk gowns, Charles's hands on her, their laughter mocking his devotion. Enough, he roared, hurling a chair against the tent wall. His aides rushed in, alarmed, but he waved them off, his eyes wild. She thinks me a puppet? I'll cut her strings. He drafted a divorce decree that night, his quill slashing the paper. I, Napoleon Bonaparte, renounce this union stained by treachery. But as he reached the end, his hand faltered. The ink blurred with a single tear, and he crumpled the page, tossing it into the sand. Damn her, he muttered, sinking to his knees. Damn her for making me weak. He couldn't sign it, not because he lacked the will, but because her hold on him was a chain he couldn't break. The campaign faltered as his focus frayed. The British sank his fleet at Aboukir Bay, trapping him in Egypt, and disease gnawed at his army. Yet Napoleon's true battle was within. He took a mistress, Pauline Fouret, a golden-haired beauty, dubbed La Belle Ilote, to dull the pain. She was spirited, eager, a stark contrast to Joséphine's aloofness, and he called her My Cleopatra. He sent her husband on a distant errand, clearing the way for stolen nights under the desert stars. If she bears me a child, he told his confidant Berthier, I'll make her my wife. But Pauline didn't conceive, and her charms faded against Joséphine's shadow. She's not her, he admitted one night, gazing at the Nile. No one is. Part 7. The Return and the Reckoning. By August 1799, Napoleon abandoned Egypt, slipping past British ships to return to France. His mind churned with plans, to seize power, to reclaim his honor, but above all, to confront Joséphine. The voyage was stormy, the sea mirroring his turmoil. He stood at the prow, the wind lashing his face, and vowed, she'll beg for me, or she'll lose me forever. He landed at Fréjus to a hero's welcome, but his heart was cold as he rode for Paris, the weight of her betrayal a stone in his chest. He arrived at their home on Rue de la Victoire, once Rue Chantereine, renamed for his victories, on October 16th, 1799. The house glowed with lamplight, but Joséphine wasn't there. She'd heard of his return and fled to meet him on the road, missing him by hours. Napoleon stormed inside, servants scattering as he barked, "Where is she?" A maid stammered, "She's gone to find you, sir." He laughed bitterly, kicking over a chair. Gone to find me, or to hide her shame. He locked himself in her bedroom, the scent of her perfume, jasmine and rose, stoking his fury. Her dresses hung in the wardrobe, her jewels glittered on the vanity, but he saw only Charles's ghost in every corner. He tore through her drawers, finding a letter from the lieutenant, innocent enough, a note of thanks for a gift, but it was fuel to his fire. "Liar!" he shouted, hurling it into the hearth. He scribbled a note of his own. "We're done, Joséphine. I'll not be your fool." He left it on her pillow and retreated downstairs, pacing like a caged beast. Part 8. Tears That Bind. Joséphine returned 2 days later, weary from travel, her children in tow. She found the house silent, the servants pale. "He's here," one whispered, nodding to the parlor. She hesitated, then pushed open the door. Napoleon stood by the window, his back to her, rigid as a statue. "So," he said, voice icy, "the Queen deigns to return." She stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Napoleon, He whirled, cutting her off. Don't speak his name. Don't lie to me again." His eyes blazed, but beneath the anger was a raw, aching hurt. "I gave you everything, my blood, my soul, and you gave me this?" He flung the rumors at her like weapons, each word a blow. Charles, the parties, the mockery. She sank to her knees, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I was weak," she sobbed. "I was lonely. But you're my life." Eugene and Hortense rushed in, their young faces streaked with tears. "Please, sir," Eugene begged, gripping Napoleon's arm. "She loves you. Don't send her away." Hortense clung to his leg, her voice a whisper. "We need you, Papa." The word Papa pierced him, a title he'd earned not by blood, but by choice. He looked at Joséphine, crumpled and broken, and the wall he'd built began to crack. "Get up," he said, voice softening despite himself. She rose, trembling, and he stepped closer, his hands hovering as if unsure whether to strike or embrace. "Why?" he asked, quieter now. "Why him?" She met his gaze, her eyes glistening. "Because he was here, and you weren't. But he's nothing compared to you." Her words hung in the air, fragile and true. Napoleon's resolve shattered. He pulled her into his arms, his breath ragged against her hair. "Never again," he whispered. "You're mine, Joséphine, always." The room stilled, the children watching as their fractured family knit itself back together. Napoleon held her tightly, the storm within him calming, replaced by a fierce, renewed vow. She was his, and he'd fight the world to keep her. The days that followed were tentative, a dance of rebuilding trust. Napoleon stayed in Paris, plotting his coup of 18 Brumaire to seize power, but his nights were Joséphine's. They spoke little of Charles. He banished the name from their home, but her touch, her presence, soothed the wounds he wouldn't name. She wore simpler gowns, stayed by his side, and wrote him notes when he worked late. "I'm here, my love, always." He read them with a faint smile, the fire of his anger cooling into something deeper, possession tempered by forgiveness. On November 9th, 1799, he overthrew the Directory, becoming first consul. Joséphine stood beside him as France cheered, her hand in his, a silent promise sealed in the chaos of revolution. Their love had survived the desert, the betrayal, the miles, but greater tests loomed, ones that would push their bond to its breaking point. Part 9. Crowns and Shadows. The dawn of the 19th century saw Napoleon ascend to heights unimaginable. After his coup of 18 Brumaire in November 1799, he became first consul, France's unchallenged master, at just 30 years old. Joséphine stood beside him, her elegance a quiet counterpoint to his relentless energy. Their reconciliation had forged a new bond, not the wild passion of their early days, but a partnership tempered by scars. She moved with him into the Tuileries Palace, its marble halls a far cry from her modest Paris home, and together they crafted a court that dazzled Europe. Napoleon's ambition burned brighter than ever. He crushed the Second Coalition, securing peace with victories like Marengo in 1800, and turned his gaze inward, reshaping France with laws, roads, and dreams of empire. Joséphine became his anchor, softening his edges for a nation weary of war. She hosted salons, her laughter mingling with the clink of glasses, her gowns, now adorned with pearls and gold, setting the fashion of the age. "You're my charm," he'd tell her, brushing a kiss across her knuckles as they strolled the palace gardens. "France loves me because you make me human." But beneath the splendor lurked a shadow. Joséphine couldn't give him a child. At 36, her body bore the wear of past pregnancies. Eugène and Hortense were her legacy from Beauharnais, but no heir emerged for Napoleon. The court whispered, advisors pressed, an empire needed a dynasty. He dismissed them at first, fiercely loyal to the woman who'd stood by him. "She's enough," he snapped to Talleyrand one evening in 1802, his voice sharp. "I'll not trade her for a broodmare." Yet doubt crept in, a slow poison fed by every barren month. Joséphine felt it too. She watched him with his nephews and nieces, his laughter bright as he tossed them in the air, and her heart ached. She tried remedies, herbal teas, prayers, even a pilgrimage to a healer in the countryside, but nothing worked. One night, as they lay in their canopied bed, she turned to him, her voice small. "If I can't give you a son, will you still love me?" He pulled her close, his arms a fortress. "You're my soul, Joséphine. No child could change that." But his eyes, shadowed in the candlelight, betrayed the war within. By 1804, Napoleon's destiny peaked. He declared himself emperor, and on December 2nd, in Notre Dame's gilded splendor, he crowned himself, then turned to Joséphine, placing a coronet on her head. She knelt before him, tears glistening as the crowd roared, her beauty radiant in an empire's gaze. "My empress," he whispered, lifting her up. For a moment, they were invincible, two souls bound by love and power. Yet the crown weighed heavy, its promise of eternity mocked by the absence of a prince. Part 10. The Crumbling Throne. The years of imperial glory were a golden blur. Victories at Austerlitz, Jena, the continent bowing to Napoleon's will. Joséphine reigned as empress, her grace a beacon amid the chaos of war. She adorned Malmaison, her country retreat, with roses and rare birds, a sanctuary from the court's scheming. Napoleon showered her with gifts, diamonds, estates, a love that burned through his grueling campaigns. "I fight for you," he wrote from the field in 1806, after crushing Prussia. "Every sword I raise is yours." But the whispers grew louder. His brothers, Joseph, Lucian, Louis, urged him to secure the Bonaparte line. "She's barren," Lucian sneered one night at a family dinner, ignoring Josephine's flinch. "You need a son, not sentiment." Napoleon slammed his fist on the table, silencing them, but the seed was planted. His affair with Marie Walewska, a Polish noblewoman, in 1807 bore fruit. A son, Alexandre, born in 1810. The boy's existence was a dagger to Josephine's heart, proof she'd failed where another succeeded. She confronted him that spring, her voice trembling as they stood in Malmaison's rose garden. "You have your heir now," she said, eyes red from sleepless nights. "Will you cast me aside?" He took her hands, his grip fierce. "Never. Walewska means nothing. You're my wife, my love." But the lie hung between them. The court's pressure mounted, and Napoleon, nearing 40, felt time slipping away. "An empire without a future is a husk," he told Berthier, his voice hollow. "I must think of France." The decision came in late 1809, a wound he'd long delayed. He summoned Joséphine to the Tuileries on December 15th, the room heavy with winter's chill. She entered, pale but regal, sensing the end. "We must part," he said, his voice breaking despite his resolve. "France demands an heir, and I can't deny her." She swayed, clutching a chair, tears streaming silently. "You're my heart," he pressed on, stepping closer. "But I have no choice." She nodded, her strength crumbling. "I'll go quietly," she whispered, "but know I'll love you till I die." The divorce was formalized the next day in a private ceremony, their hands shaking as they signed. Napoleon watched her leave, her silhouette fading down the corridor, and locked himself in his study, sobbing like a child. "I've lost her," he told Murat later, eyes hollow. "I've lost everything." Joséphine retreated to Malmaison, her world shrinking to gardens and memories, while Napoleon married Marie-Louise of Austria in 1810, a union that bore him a son, Napoleon II, in 1811. But the boy's birth brought no joy, only a cold echo of what he'd sacrificed. Part 11. The Rose That Faded. Joséphine's life after the divorce was a quiet elegy. She lived at Malmaison, surrounded by her roses, hundreds of varieties she tended with a mother's care. Napoleon sent her funds, letters, even visited in secret, unable to sever the thread between them. One spring day in 1811, he arrived unannounced, finding her pruning a bush, her hands dirt-streaked. "You're still my empress," he said, half smiling. She laughed softly, brushing soil from her fingers. "No, I'm just a gardener now, but I'm glad you're here." Their talks were tender, tinged with regret. "Do you love her?" she asked once, meaning Marie-Louise. He shook his head. "She's a duty. You're my soul." She nodded, accepting the half-truth, and they sat in silence, the past a ghost between them. Napoleon's empire began to fray. Russia in 1812, Leipzig in 1813, his star falling as swiftly as it had risen. Joséphine watched from afar, her health fading with each report of defeat. In May 1814, pneumonia claimed her. She'd caught a chill walking with the Russian Tsar, a guest at Malmaison, and her body, weakened by years of strain, gave out. She died on May 29th, surrounded by Eugène and Hortense, her last words a murmur, "Napoleon, my love." News reached him in exile, on Elba, where he'd been banished after abdicating. He locked himself in his room for 2 days, refusing food, his aides hearing only muffled sobs. "She was my life," he told Bourrienne, his face ashen. "I've nothing left." Part 12. The Flame's Last Flicker. Napoleon's story didn't end with Josephine's death. He returned in 1815 for the 100 Days, a desperate bid to reclaim his throne, but Waterloo crushed him. Exiled again, this time to St. Helena, he faced his final years in isolation, a rocky speck in the Atlantic, far from France's glory. His health declined, cancer gnawing at his stomach, but his mind lingered on her. He kept her portrait by his bed, a faded miniature from their early days, and spoke of her often. "She was my luck," he told his doctor, O'Mara, in 1820, his voice weak. "I lost her, and I lost everything." His last months were a haze of pain and memory, battles replayed, laws rewritten, but always Joséphine, her laughter echoing through the fog. On May 5th, 1821, as a storm battered the island, he lay dying, his breath shallow. His final words, gasped to the shadows, were, "France, army, Joséphine." She was his flame, wild, flawed, eternal. It had burned through betrayal, war, and exile, dimming only with his last heartbeat. Across the sea at Malmaison, her roses bloomed on, a silent testament to a love that defied empires.